We are often taught that nature's greatest threats arrive with a deafening roar. A hurricane, an earthquake, a violent storm. But history's most infamous tragedy did not begin with violence. It began with terrifying, absolute perfection. April 14, 1912. The time is 11:00 p.m. The RMS Titanic is gliding through the dark expanse of the North Atlantic at a brisk 22 knots. If you were standing on the promenade deck right now, you would not feel a single ounce of fear. You would feel an overwhelming sense of invincibility. The temperature has plummeted to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no moon. And the ocean is perfectly flawlessly flat. Sailors call it a millpond. But scientifically, this beautiful glassy surface was a fatal trap. Without waves, there is no white water breaking against objects in the dark to give a warning. Furthermore, modern atmospheric historians have proven that the freezing waters of the Labrador Current colliding with the warm Gulf Stream created a thermal inversion. This acted like a colossal optical lens, bending the starlight and creating a false horizon. Nature was literally cloaking the ice in the dark. As human beings, we are psychologically wired to suffer from complacency bias. We drop our guard entirely when our environment feels calm. The 2240 souls on board were enveloped in a masterclass of illusion. Nature had set the perfect physical trap outside. But the true tragedy is that inside the ship, humanity was busy building a much deadlier trap of its own. Let's step inside. Let's move inside into the warm embrace of the first class. At 11:15 p.m., the wealth and power of the Edwardian era are fully insulated from the freezing reality outside. Down in the first-class smoking room, the air is thick with the scent of expensive Cuban cigars. Titans of industry sit in deep mahogany armchairs, playing high-stakes games of poker. They had bought their way into a gilded cage, operating under the dangerous assumption that extreme wealth buys immunity from the laws of physics. Just a few corridors away, down in cabin 36, the ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, is intensely focused on the ship's blueprints. He is making meticulous notes on minor imperfections, a squeaky door the color of the plaster. Andrews was a genius, but he was perfecting the aesthetics of a ship whose core survival mechanism had been fatally compromised. To make room for the sweeping, luxurious open spaces of the first-class areas, the internal steel watertight walls did not reach all the way to the ceiling. It was essentially built like an ice cube tray. If one compartment filled, water would simply spill over the top into the next. Structural survival was consciously sacrificed for visual luxury. And the arrogance of design didn't stop at the walls. It extended to the very life-saving equipment on deck. Pop culture often claims the Titanic forgot enough lifeboats. The reality is much darker. It was a conscious, legal, corporate decision. Under the painfully outdated British Board of Trade regulations written in 1894, lifeboat capacity was legally calculated by the physical weight of the ship, not the number of passengers. Thomas Andrews had originally designed the deck to hold 48 lifeboats, more than enough to save every soul. But the executives at the White Star Line vetoed the idea. Why? Because they believed too many lifeboats would clutter the deck and ruin the sweeping ocean views for the first-class elite. Aesthetics were quite literally prioritized over human lives. The millionaires had bought their illusion of safety. But deep below them, separated by locked iron gates, another group of passengers was making a much deadlier mistake, the mistake of blind obedience. As we descend deep into the lower decks, we must confront a narrative heavily distorted by Hollywood blockbusters. Pop culture tells us the third-class passengers were engaged in a wild, violin-playing dance party right up until the impact. Historical records tell a much quieter and much more sobering truth. White Star Line regulations mandated that all lights in steerage be extinguished by 10:00 p.m. By 11:30 p.m., almost all of the 700 immigrants are fast asleep in their cramped bunk beds. Movies also imply they were locked below deck out of pure class malice. But the truth is far more bureaucratic. Under the strict U.S. Immigration Act of 1893, shipping companies were legally required to keep third-class immigrants physically separated behind heavy iron gates to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. The gates were locked for legal compliance. Their peaceful sleep isn't just a physical state, it's a reflection of blind societal trust. A trust that the system which locked them in cages would somehow protect them. In massive system failures, it is almost always the most compliant who absorb the catastrophic blow. Even further down, 40 feet below the waterline, exists a hellish world the wealthy passengers never saw. The boiler rooms. Here, a group of men known as the Black Gang worked in horrific conditions. While the temperature outside was freezing, inside the boiler rooms, it was a suffocating 120 degrees Fahrenheit. But they were fighting more than just the engines. For 3 entire weeks, long before the Titanic even left port, a massive underground coal fire had been secretly smoldering inside boiler room number 6. The intense, blistering heat had been pressing directly against the ship's internal steel bulkheads, fundamentally altering the molecular structure of the steel and making it incredibly brittle. And by a twist of pure merciless fate, Boiler Room 6 was the exact location where the iceberg would strike. The ship was secretly bleeding from the inside before the ice ever touched it. They were physically trapped in the dark. But the Titanic still had one last lifeline. An invisible thread stretching through the night sky. A thread that capitalist greed was about to permanently cut. So how does the most advanced machine of its time, equipped with the latest wireless technology, sail directly into a massive ice field without slowing down? Disasters of this magnitude are rarely caused by a single mistake. They are the result of what risk analysts call the Swiss cheese model, a perfect, tragic alignment of systemic failures and misaligned priorities. At 11:35 p.m., high up in the Marconi radio room, senior telegraph operator Jack Phillips is physically exhausted. Here is the fatal flaw: Phillips did not work for the ship's captain. He was employed by the private Marconi company. He was paid to send a massive backlog of personal, commercial messages for the wealthy elites. Just 40 minutes earlier, a nearby ship, the Californian, sent a blaring, urgent warning directly into Phillips' headset. "We are stopped and surrounded by ice." Deafened by the loud static and focused entirely on clearing his commercial quota, Phillips angrily fired back the now infamous words, "Keep out. Shut up. I am working Cape Race." The final ice warning was pushed aside under a glass paperweight. It never reached the bridge. But the tragedy of the radio room holds a darker secret known as the proximity paradox. The ship that sent that final warning, the SS Californian, was not hundreds of miles away. It was sitting completely stopped in the ice field, just 10 to 15 miles from the Titanic. They were so close that their officers could physically see the Titanic's lights twinkling on the horizon. But after being aggressively told to shut up, the Californian's sole radio operator simply turned off his machine and went to sleep. Later that night, the crew of the Californian would literally watch the Titanic fire distress rockets into the sky. But due to cognitive dissonance, they assumed the wealthy passengers were merely setting off fireworks for a late-night party. The greatest safety net the Titanic had was neutralized not by technology, but by a bruised human ego and sheer complacency. When safety is driven by commercial profit, warnings become annoyances. The safety net was completely gone. Now the fate of 2240 people comes down to just 2 freezing men, and 60 seconds. 11:39 p.m. 60 seconds to impact. In the smoking room, a cigar is ashed. In steerage, a child shifts in her sleep. It took humanity 3 years, 15,000 workers, and millions of dollars to build the Titanic. But nature had been preparing for this exact moment for much longer. The ice that was waiting in the dark originated from snow that fell on the western coast of Greenland around 1000 BC. For over 3,000 years, it compressed into a dense, rock-hard mountain. It was a 3,000-year-old weapon of nature, drifting thousands of miles in complete silence, just to perfectly intersect with the pinnacle of human arrogance at this exact coordinate, on this exact night. Up in the freezing crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee are shivering in the bitter wind. Another hole in the Swiss cheese model, they have no binoculars. The officer holding the key to the locker had been transferred off the ship at the last minute. Suddenly, the optical illusion of the mirage breaks. A massive, towering black void violently blots out the stars dead ahead. A black iceberg perfectly camouflaged. Fleet violently rings the brass warning bell 3 times. He screams into the telephone, "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer Murdoch has exactly 37 seconds to rewrite history. He orders the engines reversed and the wheel turned hard to starboard. But here you cannot cheat the unforgiving laws of physics. A 46,000-ton Leviathan moving at 22 knots generates hundreds of millions of foot-pounds of forward momentum. Furthermore, the ship's rudder was dangerously small compared to the immense hull. You cannot instantly stop that much kinetic energy. Time stretches. The ship agonizingly, begins to turn. Down in the cabins, people expected a deafening cinematic crash. But what they got was the most dangerous sound of all. 11:40 p.m. The impact. Because the ship was turning, it didn't crash head-on. The mountain of ice merely scraped along the starboard side. And here, another fatal engineering flaw was exposed. Modern forensic science has proven that the iceberg did not slice the hull like a can opener. Due to a shortage of high-quality materials, the shipyard used iron rivets containing high levels of glassy slag. In the freezing waters, these iron rivets became incredibly brittle. As the immense pressure of the iceberg pushed against the turning hull, the frozen rivets simply snapped, violently popping off one by one like buttons on a tight shirt, ripping the steel plates apart. To the wealthy men playing cards in first class, it felt like a faint shudder, as if the massive ship had simply rolled over a patch of gravel. A crystal glass of water trembled slightly, then settled. Someone even laughed and suggested they grab some falling ice for their drinks. Nobody screamed. Nobody panicked. This is the ultimate fatal trap of the normalcy bias. The human brain is desperately wired to believe that things will continue to function normally. When faced with a catastrophic threat, people assume everything is fine because their immediate environment still looks fine. The lights were on. The music was playing. The ship felt solid. Tragically, this psychological bias was actively weaponized by the ship's leadership. Realizing the ship was doomed and lacking enough lifeboats, the captain sought to prevent a mass panic. The ship's band didn't just bravely decide to play on their own. They were strategically ordered to the first-class lounge to play upbeat, cheerful ragtime music. It was a calculated crowd control measure designed to feed the normalcy bias. It worked too well. People were literally tapping their feet to the music, fully believing the ship was unsinkable, refusing to step into the tiny lifeboats while the ocean quietly unzipped the hull beneath them. The nightmare didn't start with a bang. It started with a whisper. Yet deep below in the pitch-dark hull, freezing ocean water was already violently rushing in at 400 tons per minute. The illusion of safety was broken. The era of unchecked industrial arrogance had just 2 hours and 40 minutes left to live. The story of the Titanic is a terrifying mirror reflecting human nature today. Look around us. As artificial intelligence develops at breakneck speeds, and as climate warnings echo through our modern radio rooms, are we ignoring the alarm simply because the floor hasn't tilted yet? What unsinkable systems are you blindly trusting today? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to step into the next chapter of history with me. Until then, stay curious.